had a good plan. Plans don't always work out. I really wanted to finish the series on Colossians last week, but what can I say? So we are still starting the new year in Colossians again. You know, there are 52 weeks in a year. This is message 68 in the book, so it's well over a year. We've been going through this book, winding down. I think there may be another one or two messages left to grind out, but here we are. So last week, we looked at a few individuals in the closing of this letter. And I realized something. A lot of times we focus on main figures, main people that are more known. And I wanted to actually go through these, which we started doing last week, because, one, it's important to know who the surrounding players were around Paul. Two, it's important to see that these folks are memorialized, whether good or bad. All right? It means that their names are in this book, whether good or bad, and that every ministry, since the writing of this letter, every ministry since this time has needed people like these individuals, the Tychicuses and the Onesimuses and the Aristarchuses. Every ministry needs support. And last week we kind of looked at a few Greek words, and I took off on that, showing fellow workers, sunergos, fellow laborers. And remarkably, I was actually very, very grateful. There were a few people that actually heard what I said last week and responded. But I'm going to tell you how many people heard what I said and responded. 7. 7. You know what? I could function if those 7 people actually stepped up to the plate, said, train me however you think I need to be trained. In other words, if these 7 people came as malleable, don't try and tell me, don't come here, don't bring your attitude thinking you're going to bring your world into the church. It doesn't work like that. And if people actually come with a heart full of faith, there's really no limit as to what can be done. But I'm still scratching my head over this. 7 people, that's wonderful. But how come only 7 people heard me? Maybe we'll find out, and there may be some clues in this final chapter. But I'm going to tell you something. I'm a big believer in this. I remember years ago, the late Dr. Scott used to say, if you don't do it, there's not another you. And he was right. But let me tell you what I've come to know. Every single person in the sound of my voice, God will give 1, 2, 3, probably unlimited opportunities. Now, that's in whatever capacity. But at some point, when you keep passing up the opportunities, like the people that Jesus spoke to when he said, follow me, suffer me first to bury my father. I've gone through this before. That's a very subtle passage that tells you that the man actually would have to wait for his father to die because he wasn't dead yet. That's the way the grammar reads. Some people will make any excuse, and they think it's a plausible one. But can you imagine if the Apostle Paul had called on a man named Tychicus, and Tychicus said he was too busy to help? Or that Tychicus's well-paying job, maybe Tychicus was a super brick maker somewhere in that territory, in that land, and maybe his business was thriving and he was making millions. But when God taps you on the shoulder, you have to be honest with yourself and honest with God. Because the opportunity that you pass up, and let me be clear about this, the opportunity you pass up will actually be given to somebody else. See, Gene Scott was right. There'll never be another you. But God is not in the business of begging people. So I've talked about this, but then let me demonstrate to you. Because of all the people that I have talked about from this final chapter, Tychicus, who is a beloved brother, faithful minister, fellow servant in the Lord, Onesimus, remember, I talked about him, the runaway slave, and now called faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner. So we can basically know that here's a man who obviously had to be incarcerated with Paul. He salutes you. And Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas, touching whom you receive commandments. If he come unto you, receive him. And Jesus, which is called Justus, who are of the circumcision, basically the Jews. These are of the Jewish, they came from the Jewish faith, basically. They're converts to Christianity. These only are my fellow workers in the kingdom of God. I want to stop there for a second before I actually get into my message to talk about this. These only are my fellow workers. Who did he catalog here? Tychicus, Onesimus, Aristarchus, Marcus, and Jesus, who is Justus. These are the ones in this group he's talking about. He says, these only are my fellow workers in the kingdom of God, which have been a comfort unto me. And can you imagine if we could turn and jump out of this book and jump to what Paul wrote in 2 Timothy when he said, basically, everyone forsook him and only Luke was with him. Here's a man who, not a coward. Here's a man who I really believe he didn't ask to become a Christian, all right? He was going about his business, doing his thing. So now gets kind of tapped on the shoulder, mildly, by God. Made no excuse, began preaching immediately. People actually, when Paul began preaching, they didn't trust him. They didn't even want to listen to him. In fact, elsewhere they said his appearance is so despicable. He's a weak man. Weak in stature, maybe weak in appearance, I don't know. But if it wasn't for the Apostle Paul answering the call of God, we wouldn't actually have 2/3 of the New Testament as we do, because he wrote it, 2/3 of it. And Christianity would be nothing more than a splinter of Judaism, because James would have risen to a position of prominence, being the Lord's brother, which means absolutely nothing in the scheme of things. So it takes people to answer a call, and it takes courage, because you don't know what you're stepping into. And I'm sure that the Apostle Paul, when he answered the call, I'm sure he did not know. I am absolutely positive he did not know he would be stepping into a life of danger, a life of hate, but also a life of love, a life of servitude to the highest degree. And I also can say that he probably did not think, when he's naming these people, Tychicus, Onesimus, Aristarchus, Marcus, and Jesus, who is Justus, that he would need these individuals, and many others, to help him. See, Paul could have preached. Paul could have arrived in Ephesus, and he could have preached, he could have established churches, but had there not been people there to be installed as overseers, to be installed as just offer your home as church in the home. Imagine if Paul would have to do it all by himself. Write the letters and then figure out how God could get him from point A to... The man wrote letters and traveled multiple missionary journeys. But can you imagine if he had no help at all? Where would we be? Where would the Church of Jesus Christ be? Now, I believe that God, who is in his infinite wisdom able to do beyond what we're able to imagine, he could have still made this all come to pass. But I'm not sure that it would have happened the way it did. So the important thing for us to remember here is that we are not living in much different times than the times that Paul lived in. There were still people who automatically believed and had faith. And there were still others that said, I'll only believe it if you can show me a miracle, if you can give me some tangible proof. We're still in the same place with the people. So if you take a look at, we start here with Epaphras. He's the next one we're going to look at. Epaphras, who is one of you. Now, he's already said that about Onesimus. So we can know that Epaphras was more than likely from that area. And then there's something interesting that they do in the King James here. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant, a slave of Christ, saluteth you. His brother says, hi, right? Always laboring fervently for you. I hate when the King James tries to get creative in translating things, when if they could just keep translating a word a certain way, we'd do just fine. So 2 words, laboring fervently. Actually, in the Greek, I'm writing it phonetically for you in English. Some of you may remember this word, agonizomai. We get our English word for agony, agonize, from this Greek word. So when it says always laboring fervently, if you have a Bible like mine, has a number beside it, the Strong's number 75, that is the translation, that word. That same word that occurs 7 times in the New Testament. 2 of them occur in Colossians, and there are a few of them that you're really probably familiar with, probably the ones that I've gone over a lot. I have fought the good fight of faith. I have fought a good fight. Those passages, and where Luke says, strive to enter in at the straight gate. All of those are the same word, to struggle, to wrestle it out. Here it's even colored even deeper, which is when it says laboring fervently. You know, when I read that, always laboring fervently for you in prayers, kind of sounds like, I don't know, he's working hard at praying, but it misses the mark because he is agonizing in prayer for you. That's what he basically, I'm not saying he spends all of his time doing, but here, always agonizing for you in prayers for a purpose, not just random generic stuff either, for a purpose, that you may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. So think of this, the purpose here is the same purpose that I stand here, and that is that we all come to the faith, that we all come to maturity of the faith, and then ultimately that we all come to that telios, that completion. And that is only done when we depart this world and are in his presence, complete, finished. So very, very interesting. And then there's a little bit more there in verse 13. Paul says, for I bear him record that he hath great zeal for you and them that are at Laodicea and them in Hierapolis. So I wrote a few things about Epaphras in my margin. They all begin with P because sometimes that's a helpful way to remember things. But I put down that Epaphras is a practical man. He's a prayerful man. His work is personal, great zeal for you. And obviously, this is a man who is very persuasive in prayer. Great zeal for you and them that are at Laodicea and at Hierapolis. And of course, this letter is at Colossae being written. So we can know This man had to be well known, and probably we don't have, Laodicea will be mentioned again. If you read down in verse, actually it's mentioned several times, the church at Nymphasis' house, that's in Laodicea, and then again in verse 16, when it says, "And when this epistle is read among you, cause that it be read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that ye likewise read the epistle from Laodicea." We don't have that. We don't have that. We know we don't have that. So it would be interesting to know what they had written. We don't have that message. What we do know is that Epaphras is an important person in Paul's universe. So with each one of these individuals, they brought something to the ministry of Paul. Not one of these individuals, I'm sure, we don't have a letter that's written, for example, by Onesimus, but Onesimus included in there, as I said last week, tells me anyone who judges people in ministry, anyone who judges, be careful, because God will use an Onesimus, and Onesimus is forgiven, given that Paul calls him faithful and beloved brother, who was once unprofitable, but his name means profitable now. So you can see all of these. Here's Aristarchus, who was incarcerated with Paul. I mean, listen, you got to have buddies for everything. I guess you have to have a buddy to be incarcerated with. That one settled in a little bit later. Might settle in with you. But Epaphras. And so here I really see the necessity of how many different people Paul actually had and used around him. The next person he mentions is Luke. Verse 14, Luke, the beloved physician. So Eusebius, who is considered to be the father of ecclesiastical history, describes Luke as Luke, who was by race an Antiochian and a physician by profession, was a longtime companion of the Apostle Paul. Luke is mentioned 3 times by Paul in our text of Colossians we're looking at, Philemon 24, and 2 Timothy 4:11, which I just quoted earlier, where that passage, Paul says, "All Asia's forsaken me, only Luke is with me." So the thing that I wanted to do here, and I really don't think I've ever spent any time talking about Luke. I want to talk a little bit about Luke. It's good to know the people and the players, but this is something that will help, I think, clarify. A lot of people are confused about this. And I think it's interesting that people are confused about this particular thing. Here we have the mention of Luke, the beloved physician. This is the same Luke who the book bears his name, the Gospel of Luke, and the book of Acts. He wrote a large portion, Luke did, of the book of Acts. Now, what's interesting is that in the book of Acts and in Luke, neither one does he name himself like many of the writers do. He doesn't name himself, nor does Luke name his brother Titus. That's an interesting one because some people didn't know that that's his brother. There's a lot of interesting background on these people, and we can glean a lot of information, not just about who these people were, what they did, how they functioned, because that's part of learning about when we talk about being a Christian. There's too many people that would like to make everything into a checkbox and a neat set of rules of do's and don'ts, but I actually think if you read this book, you can see, instead of having somebody make the checkbox for you, the checklist, what it looks like, what individuals touched by God look like. So what's interesting about Luke has the distinction of being the only non-Jewish writer of the New Testament. So a lot of times we don't think of these kind of interesting things, but if you read the opening of Luke, we also gain something very insightful. See, there are people who argue that Luke had to be around in the circle of people that traveled with Jesus. He was not. And there is actually good evidence for that. Luke, the reason why he starts off by saying he set out to set all things in order is because I believe he was getting a lot of different piecemeal stories. He had exposure to Paul, there's no question. They traveled together. But it becomes very clear to me that as Luke says he's going to set all things in order, and if you're reading Luke's writing, you can see it's one of those subtle things. Start reading and you'll recognize that Luke had to have gone to different places of notoriety where miracles occurred, where great things happened, and interviewed people and took down, okay, so tell me again what happened there. So you were at the well, or you were wherever you were, okay, and da-da-da. And now he compiles all this, puts it in his order of all things. There's also the language he uses, which is very interesting. We can tell his training as a physician. When you look at his Greek, a little bit different writing style. And so the Gospels, for example, record 15 different times when Christ prays. Luke records 11 of those. And why that's important, in certain Gospels or certain texts you can see, for example, we know when John was writing, John was trying to tell us about the eternal nature of Jesus. Luke is a little bit more difficult to figure out, but if you find the themes in Luke, prayer is one of the biggest ones. It's a large amount of Luke's writing. So it's kind of interesting that Luke is being mentioned and memorialized at the close of Colossians, almost like a little footnote. And Luke comes before Tychicus, before Onesimus. We know Luke more than any of these names. You'd think that Paul would put Luke at the beginning because he's pretty prominent, but he's not. So kind of see the order of things. That also puts things in perspective for us. Luke is the only gospel writer. I love this. There's little nuances of kind of interesting things. He's the only one that records Jesus' statement about physician, heal thyself. I think that's kind of fascinating. A physician taking note of the great healer's words and taking note of that. None of the others took note of this. So these are some interesting things to kind of look at. There is conjecture of where Luke might have received his medical training, but in the Greek world, medicine was not considered a science. It was considered more an art or philosophy, so your guess is as good as mine. There are a lot of different theories on where he might have received his education for becoming a physician. The New Testament is also silent as to when Dr. Luke may have been converted and who he listened to. See, did you ever stop and ask those questions? Who did he hear? Because, again, people confuse this and they think, well, he must have heard Jesus. But no, there's good reason to believe that maybe Luke was part of a group of people mentioned in either Acts 10 or 11, I believe it's in Acts 11, that could have been converted there. We don't know. And it'd be very interesting, only if we could find out, which we'll have to wait. But I would like to show you something that's kind of a very telltale. So there's many ways to analyze writing. We can analyze things in different ways, but I want to show you something. You turn to Acts 16 for a second. There are at least 3, possibly 4 passages in the book of Acts that I'm labeling the we sections. We or us. So if you take a look at Acts 16, and Acts 16 actually has that we or plurals, we or us in it, but really beginning at verse 11. Look at how much, it's very hard to kind of see this, but just kind of follow what I'm saying. Therefore, loosing from Troas, we came with a straight course and then we were in that city abiding certain days. And on the Sabbath, we went out. We sat down. A certain woman named Lydia, seller of purple, she heard us. So this section begins what I've called the we or the us. And the way this is written, it is not natural. See, if you get down to like verse 16, it came to pass as we went to prayer, a certain damsel possessed with a spirit of divination met us, which brought her masters much gain by soothsaying. The same followed Paul and us. So we know when it says the same followed Paul and us, Paul can't be writing this section. Somebody else is. And the us, because Paul is with, you've got Paul and Silas here, I believe. So there's obviously a third person chronicling. We can read this and you maybe don't think, who's writing this? So next time, just for fun, when you sit down and you read these sections, watch the transition between singular and plural when it does happen, and you're looking at almost little pockets of, you've got to ask the question, who's writing? And we may not know. This could be Luke. I highly suspect it is. You have the same thing that happens. Let me show you again in Acts 20. And when you start at about verse 5, these going before tarried for us at Troas, and we sailed away from Philippi. We abode 7 days. So you can find all the we parts. The plural, all right? There's another one in 27, and another one again in 28. Actually, 27:1 through 28:14 has a lot of those. The first we passages occur during Paul's second missionary journey. Paul, Silas, and Timothy arrived at Alexandria, Troas. While they were there, Paul has a vision of a man who said, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." Remember, that's in Acts 16. Luke then records, "Now after he'd seen the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding the Lord had called us to preach to them." Now when they had arrived in Philippi, Paul and Silas both were arrested. Surely, if you've read it, you're familiar with those passages. They were brought before the magistrates. Luke and Timothy are not arrested because they're Gentiles. So you've got to almost piece all of this together to make it make sense. After Paul's release from prison, Paul's encouraged to leave the city, and I mean not in the nice way either. And they did, and Luke goes on to say, "And when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica." That would be Acts 17, correct? Yep. So Luke then is no longer with them because he stayed in Philippi. You've almost got to follow these step by step, and then Luke doesn't include himself again until the second we grouping occurs. And the we narratives that occur at the end of the Apostle Paul's third missionary journey. Now we know that Luke went to Jerusalem with Paul at his third missionary journey. So it's important. Almost every Bible has one of these maps. So somebody may be saying, you're confusing me. So if you have a Bible that has a map, it shows first, second, and third missionary journeys by outlining what's on the map. So if you're confused, please consult a biblical map. It'll help you tremendously. Okay, after the Apostle Paul is arrested in Jerusalem and in prison in Caesarea, nothing is heard of again from Luke until the Apostle Paul appealed to Caesar and set sail to Rome. Well, he was going to appeal to Caesar. So it's very common among scholars when they talk about Luke to say that Luke is probably much later than Matthew and Mark, which is absolutely true. But I will tell you this, because this goes back to a lot of people who start reading the Bible and they find these, what they think are incongruities or things that they can't rectify as contradictory, but they are not. If you are looking at this book with right eyesight, you will recognize that we know Mark's gospel really that's Mark being Peter's secretary and writing for Peter. We know that Matthew, who was the tax collector, He wrote and is writing in a, we'll call it, very Jewish style of writing. And then you have John, whose writing is completely outside of the box. But what I'm trying to say to you is if you look and analyze Luke's writing, we can know certain things that maybe for people who are just starting out, they'll want to say, no, Luke had to be in the group that was an eyewitness to Christ, or Luke saw certain things. But I actually urge you to go back and reread Luke and a portion of Acts. And if you're reading it with the kind of information I've put under here, it'll become clear to you that he actually went and did these interviews to gather the information and then to put it all in order as he says he would do. Okay, what else can I tell you? We don't know what Luke was doing during the 2 years that Paul was incarcerated, but most hold the plausibility that Luke did his interviewing and went around during that time compiling information. We know that Luke was known in Colossae and was also known by Philemon. Church tradition has it that after the death of the Apostle Paul, Luke went and ministered in central Greece, and we know that as a fact. He was arrested by an angry mob and flayed there, and there's a lot of questions about how old he was, but most put his age at about 84 when they flayed him alive and crucified him. So that's in a nutshell what you have with Luke. Not too much there, except what I want to say. If we're looking at portraits of helpers, and portraits of helpers that did different things, as I said, maybe between Tychicus and Onesimus, they were the deliverers of the letters. And quite possibly Epaphras, I believe Epaphras may have functioned quite possibly as a secretary at times for Paul. And there's good reason. Let me just show you this one thing. Verse 18 down at the end says, "The salutation by the hand of me, Paul." That is because someone else wrote for Paul. He dictated, somebody else wrote, and Paul wanted to make sure that the letter bore something personal of him, so he adds in his own hand, "The salutation by the hand of me, Paul." So this was very common practice, to have a secretary, someone who would take down your words, and then a final something that says, "But I wrote the letter, I dictated it." We have this in several places in Paul's writing. Only the nutty people would interpret Paul, when he wrote in Galatians, "See what a large letter I've written you by my own hand," and assume that he wrote in large letters as opposed to a lot, voluminous. Anyway, never mind. So some people are just, I'm sorry, too stupid, all right? I just have to say it. There's some things that you can use thought and just logic and deduction on. And when you put some of these facts up, you have to wonder, where do some people get some of the information that they put out there? Internet, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, okay. Then there's Demas. So that last part of verse 14, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Notice there's no beloved Demas, no fellow worker Demas, but is not in a bad light here. But you have to go somewhere else to find out, and I've now for the third time quoted it, but let me turn there so I can read it for the folks who may not be that familiar with this passage. So we have in 2 Timothy, kind of a sad statement of affairs, if you will. 2 Timothy, 4th chapter, verse 10. Actually, let me go to verse 9. Paul is obviously not doing too good here. He says, "Do thy diligence to come shortly unto me, for Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica." And of course, read down verse 11, "Only Luke is with me." Now you've actually got a whole collection of the same names. For example, take Mark. This is the same Mark that is mentioned in Colossians. Mark, Marcus. You've got Tychicus mentioned there in verse 12 here. So you can see it's kind of the same circle of people. But Demas. Demas has a special place because I've known a lot of Demases in my lifetime. You know, they're the people that come, that you count on. They look like any other person that's committed and faithful. But man, when they leave you hanging in the lurch, they leave you hanging. Now, I'll tell you something. I don't share too much dirty laundry here. I'll share this with you. Over the years in ministry, I've had a couple of people do that. You know where you depend on them? You really depend on people. You do. And because they may or may not see or understand their value in God's eyes, in God's work, I don't know if it's the devil that gets into their mind or they just get tired or want to, let's just do something just to stir up enough to make life difficult for Pastor Scott. And if people that just, committed workers and then one day just decide, not even giving me the dignity of telling me that, like most people give a 2-week notice, or they'll give a month notice, or they'll say, my schedule's not right, or I've got work-related issues, which I always try to endeavor to solve and to help people work out so that people can have a work schedule that is conducive to their situation and circumstance. But I have had people that I've depended on, key people, just flake out over the years. And I'm going to tell you something. I'm so grateful that I have the example of Demas, that Paul, I'm not happy it happened to Paul, but I'm actually happy that I have an example. Otherwise, I would think it's just me. See, that's why I love the Bible, because there are so many different personalities. You can not only find yourself, but you can find a lot of the people around you. And you can find that history, most certainly does repeat itself in God's book over and over again, with God basically saying, now I'm going to tell you what I want done. Oh, why? We don't know what you want done. We don't understand anything. We're hard of hearing. It's the same circle over and over and over again, if you're actually paying attention. Demas is memorialized in Colossians as simply an afterthought after Luke. But he's memorialized in 2 Timothy as having flaked out, having basically left Paul in a lurch. And I think it's kind of interesting because had there been no mention of that, or there's another mention of another individual who did much harm, Alexander the coppersmith. But I love the fact that these individuals are there because it brings clarity that people often will come. Some people come for the right reasons. Some people come because they've got nothing better to do. They'll step up to the plate. I'm sure Demas told Paul, I can do it. I'll be your Luke. But instead, now he had a thing. He loved this present world. Now, some people in the sound of my voice today will figure out that there are still people who still love the world. And there are still people actually in the church who are more in love with the world than they are the idea of eternity and the things of God. So let's go back into our text because there's more. Yes, there's more. Verse 15, salute the brethren which are in Laodicea and Nymphas, and the church which is in his house. Nymphas. I find it fascinating. Nymphas, whose name means bridegroom, obviously had not lost his love for the Lord. In fact, I want you to think about something. The fact that he's mentioned Nymphas and the church which is in his house. He didn't open up his house to one person like we sometimes do. We invite an individual in. He opened up his house to the family of God. That's a lot more than just inviting one person in or giving one cup of cold water. Now, listen, can you see the different functions each of these people might have, including Demas? the disappointment. Can you see each one of these? For example, Mark was a problem back then, right? That caused that split between Paul and Barnabas. Well, let me just tell you, the fact that he's mentioned here tells me that Paul forgave him. So I can see how Paul would have potential issues with people, but then fixes it, and now they're back working together. And Marcus, sister, son, Barnabas, blah, blah, blah. So you can see there's a lot we can glean, even in the smallest pieces of information. But there's one last mention here that I want to talk about, and that's this person in verse 17. And say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which thou hast received in the Lord, that thou fulfill it. Let me tell you what that says of that individual. That man, or that person, might not be fulfilling his calling. Let me read that again. And say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which thou hast received in the Lord, that thou fulfill it. So methinks, first of all, what I know, Archippus was the son of Philemon. It's a small world after all, right? And Paul talks about the guarding of one's ministry. Take heed. So we have basically a picture from God's economy. If you step back like a bird's eye view, you can see the laborers that labored, the laborers that labored for a time and then took off, and the ones that labored but kind of maybe in a very lazy way, not actually putting heart and soul into what they're doing, but maybe just going through the motions. I don't think God takes too kindly to that either. So what can we have as a takeaway here? That God uses a variety of people. There's always going to be a whole rainbow of people. Some people come and they are highly educated. Other people come and they have no education at all. Literally, they graduated their maybe high school. God doesn't care. See, this is the thing I want people to get over. God doesn't care if you think your education isn't. We know what God cares about? That you would stand up for him in a time when it is needed. That God knows that he can count on you, because he knows he can't count on us. We're failures, we're flops, we're faulted, all right? But that certain knowledge that God enables us when he does call us, I see the potential for a lot of people to share in the rewards that began It all works together. Someone preached a message in 1975. That message was Gene Scott. And somebody transcribed that message and made it into a readable form that was then put into a book at my behest to do. But those individuals that participated, I want you to think about this. And you may say, well, how do you get that? The Bible tells me this. You helped with that. I gave the example of a message preached in 1975. Well, you might say, well, Gene Scott preached the message in 1975. Yeah, and because you helped do that, you're sharing in the rewards of that message being preached and those rewards that keep continuing to accrue. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, because you got to keep going back. So as I keep bringing forth Paul, it's almost like the ministry does not stop. For anybody that thinks once the minister dies, close the shop and go home. It is our duty as custodians to be prepared. It's our duty to stand and say, let's build that the foundation may not be moved. And we know the foundation of this church is Jesus Christ, but the people. So I've taken the time here to look at these to tell you, as all of these people have been memorialized in God's book, I have news for you. This book has been closed. God's book, the book that is spoken of in the book of Revelation, has not yet been closed. And your name may still be in that book. You may stand at some point and say, I'll stand for God, I'll step up to the plate. Not reluctantly because Pastor Scott has been nagging me for weeks, not because I feel like I have nothing else I can do, but because I recognize that this is the time that I am needed in God's kingdom, period. And if that can be clear, We can move a lot of mountains together. I'm ready to start moving mountains. Are you? How many of you remember this? Because most of you were around. And only a handful of you participated in this. And oh boy. We were downtown. The church was downtown. This church had been abandoned, basically. We came here once or twice a year when a parade blocked the streets. I came with maybe 4 or 5 people with me. That then petered down to 2 or 3. And I've told you the story. Every crevice, every door, every cupboard in this ministry was filled with junk and garbage. And it was like the people who were here before, I just got to say it, they were just nothing but pigs. Okay? And I spent days, literally days, in one particular area of this building that was so dirty. I mean, I would come home, it looked like I was working in a chimney, like soot dirty. I'd come home dirty every single day from cleaning up the mess. And I will never forget the people, the few that worked with me, that helped me. They didn't know that I was cleaning the building up because I was going to fix it up. No one knew. They just knew I was doing something, and they were going to help me. And to this day, I am grateful to those individuals. I see one sitting at the back, and I know there's 2 others over here. Because had I not taken the initiative, I don't know what would be at this point. It takes somebody to start, and it takes another person to come alongside and say, yeah, I'll do it with you. And it takes another person to come alongside and say, okay, this isn't the most glamorous thing, but I'll join in with you until we have movement. We've got motion. We're going forward. We're doing something. And we did. And we took a long time to clean every part of this building out, throw away the junk, clean it up. And then there was the people who did all of the repairs and the renovations and all the fixing. I can't do that. I'm not trained to do that. And I could name a lot of people. They came and had specialty and helped out in the areas they could. Your names are memorialized in God's book for what you've put your hand to, for what you've touched, for your attitude of saying, I, in my lifetime, may be insignificant, but my name will be memorialized in God's book. I participated, and not because somebody had to coerce me, somebody had to beg me, somebody had to say, for the love of God, will you do it? But something inside me that said, I am going to step up to the plate because it's the thing that I'm supposed to do. Now, I will not say another word about this because I've said enough that I think for those people who understand the degree of the need that we have is going to require a couple of you to step up to the plate. Now, I'd only tell you one thing. My current staff, the current folks that are doing what they do, they've been with me for a long time. And we've been through a lot together. But I think if you ask them, I'm not going to put words in their mouth. I think if you ask them, they'll tell you in their own words what it means to them and what their life is like. I don't tell you that working for the ministry is, as I said, you're not going to get rich. You're not going to become famous. You're probably going to be frustrated, and you might even go a little nuts. Applications. That's inspiring, right? But for real, but seriously, I was being serious there. What I'm saying to you is I'm grateful to God that He touched the hearts and the minds of the people who are standing with me. I'm grateful to God for the people that He's brought, that He's opened the ears. Now I'm grateful to God that He's opening so many doors for us. Now, I have to do my part. I do my part in bringing the Word and opening up the Word and being prepared, but I can't do it alone. So I leave this with you as the first message of the year, but something for you to ponder and consider. There will be a time, I think, when you will look back and you will either be grateful that you answered even for a time, or you will think nothing of it until the time that you have to give an answer as to why you couldn't even muster up one small degree that says, you know what, I can't give a lot of time, but I have some spare time here. I'm available. What do you need? Or better yet, don't tell me what you need. You just show up. The quality of people that I'm looking for may be beyond uncommon, because I'm not looking for people to come so that they can figure out when their next raise is going to be or how long their vacation pay or their vacation is going to be. Hopefully you'll understand when I say to you, and I've been saying this for a long time, but the last 2 weeks, this has been my message, and I really hope this sinks in. To those who have answered the call, I appreciate it. To those who are sitting there saying, yeah, I know, but it's not my problem, it will be one day. Trust me, it will be. How this ministry has functioned since 1975, I don't care about what came before, but since 1975 is nothing short of a miracle. Through massive lawsuits, through boycotts, through people walking around the church to keep people out of the church, I could catalog, I could keep going. We are not yet in the worst crisis. The worst crisis is yet to come. So basically what I'm saying to you as a church is soldiers in the army of God are needed. And if you think that this one is just like all the others, you're wrong. We have a need. We need bodies. This will be the year for at least 5 of you to step up to the plate. And I think you're going to find something. Working for this ministry is 100% a tough. It's not like you come here and it's easy and you just slide into a position. But it is very rewarding to know that, you know you're doing something right when everything you do basically ends up being attacked. When you know that it's the relentless onslaught every day, I'm doing the right thing, I'm in the right place. Now, if you can stand that with a strong back, you're going to do just fine. But for those of you at home, especially those King's Houses who have been faithful and committed over all these years, supporting, watching, listening, you're included in this too, not just because I'm just talking to the people in front of me, but anyone who has said this ministry matters to them, I'm talking to you. So that's all I have to say about that. I intend to build, and when I say build, God has been building. I'm just going to be filling in the places where we need the support and the structure in the foundation. This is going to be a breakthrough year for us. So that's why I said important for those people who recognize I can't do it alone. And the people yet working in this ministry, they're overworked. They can't do it all either. So hopefully someone today, by God's grace, is understanding what's needed and will step up to the plate. I'm going to be looking for your message because I know you're out there, whoever that person is. I'm eager to read your message. Now, with that said, I want to close this message off by saying a big thank you. Paul spends the close of the letter basically itemizing the folks. I want to spend a few minutes here doing something that I would have done last week at the end of the year, but I want to do it now. It's never too late. I want to thank all of the people in every capacity. When I think about the people who answer the phones, and not just on the times when everybody's there, but the difficult times, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the morning. Thank you for doing that and for the people that come in, that clean toilets, that vacuum, that prepare the communion. There are people that are here 24 hours a day in shifts doing security. There are people running an air shift. There are so many different things going on 24 hours a day. And what I want to say to all of you who help, thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, because I do know how blessed I am that God gave me really amazing people to stand shoulder to shoulder with during these very crazy and uncertain times. I am proud of my staff, and I'm proud of what is behind us. So that's why I said to you, I'm looking forward with the eyes that say, we will build. I'm not building a mega church or some mega structure to man, but what I want to build is something that will be a floodgate for anyone who desires the Word of God, unadulterated, unfiltered, just the Word of God brought forth, and it takes people to do that. So that's my message today, and to my staff once more. And only maybe in eternity may you actually know the depth of my gratitude. But thank you. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.